California Governor Gavin Newsom signed an executive order that will send every California voter a mail-in ballot for the 2020 elections. This will make California the first state in our nation to have universal mail-in voting. And there are two major problems with this. First of all, Newsom said no Californian should be forced to risk their health in order to exercise their right to vote, end quote. But is voting in person dangerous to your health because of COVID-19? According to a new scientific study, no. Scientists at Stanford and the University of Hong Kong ran a study after the Wisconsin election on April 7th, 2020, and found no detectable surge in SARS-CoV-2 transmission due to the April 7th, 2020 Wisconsin election. Not exactly the story you've heard from the mainstream media, is it? The scientists write, and I quote, "Up to 300,000 people voted in person, and waiting times in Milwaukee averaged 1.5 to 2 hours. Poll workers had surgical masks and latex gloves. Hand sanitizer was made available to voters. Isopropyl alcohol wipes were used to clean voting equipment, and painting tape and signs were used to facilitate social distancing." They write, "The lengths of the incubation period and the reporting delay imply that April 7th infections would not be reported until April 17th on average, with most cases being reported during April 11th to 22nd. Taken together," they write, "there's no evidence to date that there was a surge of infections due to the April 7th, 2020 election in Wisconsin, which has a relatively low level of SARS-CoV-2 transmission in the U.S., end quote. But remember when the mainstream media was reporting that people got COVID from voting in Wisconsin? Well, these scientists address that. They write, "The Wisconsin Department of Health Services announced on April 22nd that 19 people who either voted in person or worked at the polls on April 7th have tested positive for SARS-CoV-2, although several of these people also experienced non-voting exposures. This fact is not inconsistent with our population-level analysis, because 19 cases is small relative to the total number of confirmed cases in Wisconsin. To put this information into perspective," they write, "if we assume that the SARS-CoV-2 fatality rate among symptomatic patients who were physically capable of voting in person on April 7th, not including nursing home residents, if we assume this is 1%, then we would expect 0.19 deaths out of 300,000 people, which is the fatality risk of driving an automobile approximately 50 miles. However," they write, "in addition to the individual risk of voting on April 7th, there is community risk. How many downstream cases will these 19 original cases generate? The reproduction number," they write, "in Wisconsin has been hovering near the value of 1 for all of April. If this value is much larger than 1, as it was in, say, January, then these 19 cases would cause a lot of downstream damage. And if this value is clearly smaller than 1, they would cause minimal damage. But a value near 1, coupled with a small number of cases, means that it's very difficult to reliably predict the amount of downstream damage. Taken together, it appears that voting in Wisconsin on April 7th was a low-risk activity." A low-risk activity. That is the science. And it contradicts Governor Newsom's fear-mongering. That's the first problem. The second problem is mail-in ballot voting is vulnerable to voter fraud. I know Democrats deny this, but there's simply too much evidence of voter fraud to dismiss it. Take ballot harvesting, for example. Ballot harvesting allows a third party, that means any person, to pick up mail-in ballots from voters and drop off those ballots at the polling place of the voter. Sounds innocuous, right? Well, don't be fooled, it's not. It's illegal in many states because ballot harvesting is so ripe for fraud. In California, for example, where ballot harvesting is legal, a Democratic operative was caught on video knocking on voters' doors asking to deliver their mail-in ballots to the polling place for them, but only if they were Democrat voters. In Texas, so-called ballot pirates intercepted ballots of elderly voters and fraudulently filled them out, forced signatures, and returned the ballots to the polling location. This is actually not an ideological issue. In North Carolina's 9th congressional district, a Republican candidate for office engaged in an illegal ballot harvesting operation to get more votes for himself. To put it plainly, ballot harvesting is ripe for fraud, and universal mail-in voting enables fraudulent practices like ballot harvesting, because how do you verify that the ballot was, in fact, filled out by the voter and not by fraud? You can't. And in California, you can get a driver's license if you're an illegal alien. And California has a motor voter law, which means everybody who gets a driver's license is automatically registered to vote unless they check a box saying they are not eligible to vote. How many illegal aliens do you think check that box? We don't know, which means we must say no to universal mail-in voting.